I want to give you a very brief introduction to abiotic factors in ecosystems. So when we look at the physical environment of an ecosystem, what we're really talking about is the habitat, the nutrients, the resources available to the biotic or the organisms living in those environments. So what we have to start to set up are these kind of food webs. So who's eating who? And who's benefiting when something dies, who's looking at recycling some of the nutrients and energy available in these systems. And primarily what we focus on with our abiotic factors are two major categories: the conditions of the environment, so things like temperature, rainfall, and so on. But then we can also look at the resources that exist, so nutrients, the water availability, not just the rainfall. And primarily what we look at as far as these types of nutrients would be, there are 30 vital life elements or 30 vital nutrients that you have to have. Not all of the ones that we find on the planet, of course, do we use, and some of them are actually toxic. We've talked about that before. But then we also look at other molecules that would be vital, such as water. In these systems, we do something we call biogeochemical cycling. And essentially, this is movement of water and nutrients between biotic organisms and abiotic components. So how do you get nutrients from the environment to an organism and back again? So it really is all about natural recycling. So we look at light energy coming in, and plants convert that light energy into chemical energy. And then that chemical energy is used by organisms who give off energy then as heat in a third step. Now, energy is lost with every one of these steps. We talked about that a very long time ago when we looked at molecules and ATP, energy production in organisms. But that's fine for energy. Energy moves through a system. But what we look at more importantly sometimes, not that energy is not important, but we spend more time thinking about this chemical cycling. And so this is really the recycling of nutrients in an environment, because many times these environments are so isolated that they have to recycle within themselves and reuse these nutrients. So things like the carbon cycle. Of course, carbon dioxide coming into our trees through photosynthesis, being picked up by primary consumers, eaten by higher level consumers, and then those consumers return CO2 to the atmosphere through normal respiration and cellular respiration. But we also have this step of decomposers down here at the bottom. So we have to keep in mind this constant interaction between biotic, abiotic, in the environment. Things like the phosphorus cycle. All of the phosphorus that you need to build your DNA and other structures inside your body come from literally rocks. So the phosphates weather out of rocks, get into the soils, we pick them up through plants, and then we eat those plants and we continue to recycle it through. So these basic processes. Nitrogen cycle. We've talked about this before with nitrogen fixing bacteria and how they're able to take in nitrogen from the soils and from the atmosphere, convert it into usable forms for the plants. The plants get eaten by the animals return nitrogen to the soil through urine, and the cycle continues. So we have to keep in mind what we are doing to influence these cycles. Those are natural cycles I just showed you. What we look at is what we contribute to those. Things like synthetic fertilizers contribute very high levels of nitrogen back to the soil in the form of ammonia. We actually convert atmospheric nitrogen through something known as the Haber process into synthetic fertilizers. We have increased the rate of conversion. This is a problem. You have to think about what effect this will have on the nitrogen cycle. Go back. Look at the nitrogen cycle. If I add more ammonia to that system, what effect will it have on that cycle? When we look at the addition of fertilizers in the Midwest, particularly to cornfields that sustain our agricultural system in the United States, we add those synthetic fertilizers. Those fertilizers are added in excess. That ammonia runs into the river, particularly into the Mississippi River, and drains into the Gulf of Mexico, creating this thing known as a dead zone down at the bottom. Hypoxia is the lack of oxygen in the system. Why do I care if there's no oxygen in the Gulf of Mexico? Well, if there's no oxygen in the Gulf of Mexico, everything dies. So we end up with these fish deaths every year associated with nitrogen runoff from farm fields that end up in the Gulf of Mexico and kill the fish. And what we have to wait for is this cycling and the movement of water in and out from the Gulf of Mexico and the tides to stir it and return all of that oxygen to the coastlines and help with this process of replenishing oxygen and keeping those organisms healthy. Excess nutrients leads to something known as eutrophication. You see this pond here. There is a pond in there, I promise. Most of us don't want to swim in this, but as a natural kind of system, this is what happens with excess nutrients. This happens naturally in many systems in the springtime. When the sun comes out, the algae go nuts. They get very excited, grow quickly, and lots of nutrients are contributed to that system fast. You end up with kind of this murky, disgusting looking pond. But for the organisms that live in it, for a time, it's a good thing. We'll talk later about when it becomes bad. We also have to look at water cycling, right? Water's a critical resource. All of our water that we have on this planet is all we have. So we have to look at how it gets cycled, evaporated from the oceans, back into the clouds, condenses and comes back down onto land, keeping this cycle flowing. Most of what we're dependent on is this surfaced water and groundwater for our freshwater supplies. Most of the Earth's water, though, is salt water. Nearly all of it, very little of it, is in freshwater systems, and most of what is in freshwater is actually locked up in ice caps and glaciers. Please don't look at melting the ice caps and glaciers as a solution to our water problem. Our water problems are more about these aquifers or underground sources of water in the United States and in other countries as well. Most of what we get from our well water and city water comes from either confined aquifers, those that are completely enclosed, or unconfined aquifers, those with runoff from mountains and into what we would call reservoirs, right? In the Midwest, again, we have huge underground stores of water in something known as the High Plains Aquifer. This is not going to be sustained. We look at, since the 1940s, more than 200,000 wells have been put onto this aquifer, and we draw out the water from it on average, looking at several billion gallons of water per day are taken out of this aquifer. So what do you think it's taken out for? What are they using the water for? Primarily agriculture.